festival powered by Union Bank of India.
Good evening. My name is Indira Chandrasekhar. One of the very proud moments in my life and literary career was when Ranjit Hoskote reached out to ask if I would take on the curatorship of literature at the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. Since then, he's been a generous and gentle supporter, encourager, mentor, colleague, and I'm grateful. As is well known, he's been associated with the festival in different ways from its very beginning 22 years ago. And among the many things he was responsible for initiating at the festival were poetry readings, liberal with time, with selection and combination of poets, with reach outside the city and the country, truly celebrating Bombay, Mumbai's long and sharp creative focus on poetry, a focus that Arundhati Subramaniam spoke to at last year's live festival. At the Kala Ghoda Festival, Ranjit first developed a pen-branded feature called Under the Tree of Tongues, and later presented it at the David Sassoon Library as the wonderfully titled Hope Street Poets. I will quote now from his missive to me in December 2018. So Hope Street Poets, in homage to the original name of the L-shaped street on which the Sassoon Library is situated. Now called David Sassoon Library Mark, it was originally called Hope Street. And when I first came to Elphinstone College, the name in 1984, the name struck me as being most allegorical. And for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Bombay, Elphinstone College overlooks the David Sassoon Library and the courtyard garden where the literature stage of the festival sits in live times. Today's session, curated with Ranjit, again under the banner of PEN, in it we feature the second in the series that Ranjit titled Beats and Cadences, where we look at ways in which poetry and music speak to each other. Our first session featured T.M. Krishna and Perumal Murugan. Many people mistakenly associate the rhythms of poetry as being indicative of a natural relationship with music. Perhaps dear Bob's Nobel Prize further embeds that notion. But apparently not everyone does, however, because I came across a rather wonderful essay in the December 1925 release of Vanity Fair by Winthrop Parkhurst and L.M. Hussey, titled Tone Deaf Poets. It opens, and I quote, "The unsophisticated hold commonly to the belief that the practitioner of one art is by nature wholly sympathetic towards all the others." He goes on to say, "The intimate kinship of poets and musicians is almost universally conceded. The poets are musicians by nature, if not by precise training." I close the quotes, but then there follows a diatribe against the idea. Of course, the truth lies between these two extremes. All poets are musicians on one hand, or that no poet is a musician. So we have arranged 3 surely fine conversations conducted by Ranjit with Ruth Padel, deeply musical with her book of poems, Beethoven Variations, musician and Hindustani singer Shubha Mudgal, who works with text, with poetry, and with poet and musician Jeeth Thayil. As we state at the start of each session, the formal bios of each panelist is available on the website, so I will not repeat them here. And of course, we're always grateful for the patronage that makes organizing these sessions possible. This festival is powered by the Union Bank of India. Over to you, Ranjit. Thank you, and to the poets.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Indira, for your very gracious and generous introduction. It's really been a pleasure to see how you've steered the literature section of the Kala Ghoda Festival into new, experimental, and marvelous directions. So it's in that spirit of an interplay between continuity and rupture that I want to enter this space of discussion that we have here, because that is really one of the, I would think, one of the key rhythms that preoccupy us as poets, as musicians, and as people who live and work in the space between these disciplines. And I'm really privileged to have this very distinguished panel of speakers today, friends, colleagues, people whose work I've admired and respected over a long period. And the way we'll go about this is I'll invite each speaker to say a little maybe about their own practice, to delve into the relationship between poetry and music in their work, and really for this to be 3 memoirs of practice, if you will. And then as we go along, we'll work to a more plenary sort of discussion and carry the conversation forward also to the audience. And I'd like to begin with Ruth. Ruth, you were trained as a classicist, and classical mythology has this, both the Greek as well as other classical mythologies have this very, very strong connection that they make between poetry and music, but also between poetry and music on the one hand and dissent on the other. Dissent that might be interpreted by the gods as arrogance, but which also is an incredibly human expression of freedom. So I'm thinking here of 2 figures in Greek myth, Orpheus and Marsyas. So Orpheus, of course, as we all know, even after he had his head ripped off by people who didn't really appreciate the effect of his music, and the head is thrown into the river and it goes floating down and it's still singing. It's incredible. It's an image of how art survives. And Marsyas is, I mean, he discovers or invents one instrument, but then challenges Apollo, challenges the gods, and is said to be defeated in that context, and then pays with his life. It's a brutal punishment. He's flayed, literally. So there's something incredible about these metaphors for where music can lead us in terms of agency and freedom. So could I invite you, Ruth, to take us back maybe through the time when you first encountered classical mythology, your own work as a classicist, and how that prepared you, so to speak, for a life in music and in poetry?
Yes, thank you, Ranjit. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Andira. And looking forward to the others very, very much. My introduction to classical Greek mythology began really after my introduction to classical Western music, because I came from a music-making family. My parents met playing music, clarinet and cello. And my father taught me Greek. So I think I was thinking with mythology before I could really read, I think. Orpheus, of course, is the great creator who goes down into the underworld to look for the figure he loves, and takes his art with him. And I thought possibly I might start with, if I could, this is from a book called Emerald, which was about my mother after she died, aged 97. And it's emerald because green emeralds are an image of hope and renewal. And about a year after she died, I went down with some friends into one of the Ice Age caves in the south of France, where there's the very earliest art. And we were taken down, and I'll just read a little bit of this, because there's a kind of catabasis, which is the great Greek motif of descent to the underworld, which of course Orpheus does with other figures as well, to find something that's valuable to you. And it's really an image for a poet of going into yourself, into your dark, into your past, facing your monsters and finding out what's valuable and bringing them up again. So the guide asked if anyone would sing. This salon, she said, is only one of many caves. We wonder if the artists over the centuries chose this chamber for the acoustic, resonant as a cathedral. Try. I wondered if an echo might set off an avalanche, and the whole cave system, the cracked, mysterious mass of hollow stone, would crash, bury us under the mountain. But the notes, when they came in that black air, were a flow of prayer, a thread of unearthly melody, like the deep space vibrato of a theremin. Surely not from my throat. Our guide followed my song upward with her with her torch, a wing-bone of white light, floating into tiered funnels of jagged stone, as if lifting us on feathers of pure sound to the point where all sound disappeared. I imagined the voice of Orpheus, his aria to life and hope, ringing out in the kingdom of the dead. Here, in deep earth, the black blossom of morning still sifting within me, I remembered that emerald was my birthstone, that an emerald, mined in the dark, but lucent green as leaves returning after 100,000 years of ice, green for awakening, for bringing life back from the dead, renewal in earth and of the earth, is a token of rebirth. And I understood how anyone in darkness longs for green, for the animal life which goes with green, which lets us see the impossible, our own lives with their faults and wounds in a different way, and how the very idea of one gem for our birth might make us try to say the story of ourselves with a whole heart, to carry the true good burden of being known, even by animal eyes, and not alone, like the singer who drew all life towards him and went down into the dark, taking his art into the earth, and art takes him up to the light again, renewed. And I feel that that's really what poetry is for me. You go down into the dark of yourself and bring something up to the light. And that's also like voice. I'm so looking forward to hearing Shubha sing. But when I sing, and I was trained a bit, I've always sung all my life, but I think singing is for me the shape of the poem. It gives me the shape of the poem.
Wonderful.
And it comes from inside out.
Ruth, that was amazing. Thank you so much for taking us deep into the process of catabasis, of going the journey of descent, of moving down to within oneself, within one's inheritance, to archetypal layers even. And this brings me to the titan of music, whose work you've devoted yourself to in recent years, with Beethoven Variations, which I have here. And I just wondered if in Beethoven's work you found both a dynamic that was, related to this catabasis, this constant retreat to deeper levels, but another mechanism that produced some kind of immense modernity and what we would recognize as the modern spirit of opposition, of making one's own way against the current or the establishment. Did you see Beethoven as a revolutionary figure?
Yes, of course. Opposition is the total DNA of his character and his music, and this starts really when with his father. Shall I read a poem about his
yes, please.
father? So you have to understand that he was born in 1770 in a very musical culture. His father was a musician, not a brilliant musician, but good enough to realize that his 3-year-old was a kind of genius. And he was opportunistic. He was a not very good entrepreneur, and he hoped that this would be another Mozart and would make his fortune. So he sort of beat the music into him. He was often drunk, and he was quite violent. But he did teach Beethoven piano and also violin and viola. So this is really the idea that Beethoven's whole musicality, which was his whole life, came from his father, and yet he had this very, very hurt, wounded, angry relationship with his father. If your father damaged you, the way meteorites spin in, clustering on Antarctic ice, bare shields of glacier burnished by ferocious wind, because your father is magnetite, dragging all the iron in your soul into his own force field. You seal yourself in. You need nothing but music. Your answer to obstruction will be fire. In the little hall of the house where you were born, the one original surface is dark silver flagstones where you might have crawled. Light falls in shallow hollows of deciduous rubbed stone, clogged with spume of cleaning fluid, where I imagine your mother carrying the shopping, your father staggering home drunk, up these stairs, their new-cut wood now polished to the amber shine of a harvest moon, to wake you in the middle of the night, stand you for hours on the bench so you can reach the keys. You cry as you play, slapped if you make a mistake. In daylight, he hears you improvise, splashing around, he calls it, on the violin. What rubbish are you scratching now? Isn't that beautiful? No, you made it up. You're not to do that. Stop, or I'll box your ears. If your father damaged you the way fierce winds scour glacier ice where meteorites have fallen from heaven, but he was the one who made you. Beat the notes into you on the clavier, viola, violin. Your response to challenge ever after will be attack. You will need no one, only the relationship of sound and key. You improvise. So I love that. Can you hear me all right? Is that all right? Yeah.
Ruth, yes, I can hear you. We can all hear you. Yes.
So I mean, I think it's fascinating that it was improvising that his father told him to stop and threatened him with boxing his ears. And of course, his ears are damaged by the time he's 30 forever. And yet the way that he came up, the way he made his name as a young pianist at 20 was exactly that, by improvising. And so in the context of Indian music of all kinds, I'm thinking about improvising a lot. I thought about improvising a lot while I was writing poems about his life, about him going deaf. Because what's it like if you can't hear, if you're improvising and you can't hear your own voice or your own instrument? What happens? And yet improvising also helped him. I think when he was going deaf, he could turn inward into his own rhythms and patterns in a very, very sort of almost an autistic way, perhaps. And I thought I'd read you one poem called "The Jealous Demon," when he first begins to confess to his friends by letter that he is going deaf. He says, "My hearing has become weaker in the last 3 years. This infirmity was caused by my bowels." That's what the doctors told him. I mean, this is what's sort of 1800, which, as you know, are in a wretched state. "I was often in despair. The humming in my ears continues day and night." And he says, "There's this jealous demon in my ears." Wondering about Beethoven's brain, the improviser, the variations man, I stare at diagrams of research on rappers and jazz artists. If you can't hear what you're doing, how do you make the darkness echo? Where does the newness go? Doctors pour oil in his ears, bind poisonous bark around his arms to raise angry blisters, lance and drain imaginary toxins. His shoulders run with pus. He dreams of galvanism and electric wire. He asks for his grandfather's portrait to be sent from Bonn. May the dead protect him. So this is what's happening to him when he knows all the art is inside him, and he does think of suicide, but he decides to live for his art. He goes outside Vienna to a country village to rest his ears for 6 months, and in those 6 months he comes to terms with the fact that this will never be cured, that these doctors are a waste of time. He has to get on with writing the art that he knows is in him. I mean, he knew he was a genius. And it's in those 6 months at the end of it that he starts to write the Eroica Symphony. And this is where it's interesting. You started with these mythical figures. I'd love to know if there's a sort of comparable figure in Indian mythology to Prometheus, because just before he left Vienna to go to the country, he was asked to write ballet music for Prometheus, and he did. And one of the tunes in it stayed with him. He wrote a series of piano variations on it, and it became the major theme for his Eroica symphony. But Prometheus is another, like Marsyas, also Orpheus, is another figure of creativity, because he steals fire, which is the source of all human creativity in a way, or image of it, and gives it to human beings. But he suffers for it. It's a stolen gift, and he's chained to the rock, and the vulture eats his liver. So this is a picture of Beethoven in that country village, going for walks. He loved nature and going for walks, and thinking about creativity and fire and suffering. Human fire. You spend mornings composing, tossing away old drafts and crumpled balls, then plunge into veins of forest. The notebook swings in your pocket. Inspiration springs from shadow, thistle chandeliers, red nipples of wild haws. You are Prometheus, the benefactor, stealing flame to give to humans. A shiver ray, creating and destroying. You are defiance, a golden razor, a regatta, Lucifer, falling and flickering with the discipline of fire break. Melody and rhythm flow from the molten blue of summer hills. But there's a coppery stain on the rising moon. You know creation comes with pain. The stolen gift draws punishment in its wake and ends in the rock, the vulture, and the chain. You stride on through the woods. You believe in freedom, human fire, created out of clay. So that leads really to the Eroica, which is his first great heroic masterpiece and ushers in 10 years of defiant, heroic music. Most of the Beethoven that we hear in concert halls today was written in these 10 years, except for the late period, the sort of wonderful late period. So he is constantly falling in love, but also losing the women all the time. And I thought I might just read the first poem in the book, which is about my parents' meeting, which is called Listen. And I'm thinking really about listening, about how important it is when you're playing music or singing music with other people to listen. They say the ear bone, shaped like the bowl of a tiny spoon, lasts longest when we die. The soul might be like this, hard, necessary, almost nothing. My parents got together at a music camp. A clarinetist dropped out of the orchestra and my dad queued for the village payphone, called a girl he'd just met, hired a tandem bike and fetched her from the station. I like to picture her on the edge of knowing, legs whizzing round, her clarinet case tied behind. He'd have done that for her. He always took great pains with making safe. Between hedgerows of early summer, she's cycling into a lifetime with him. Look, there we are, waiting for her, 5 future string players, hiding among the vetch and willow herb. She played the piano too. At first, she accompanied him in duets. I see them working on Beethoven's cello sonata, opus 69. She's listening to him, he's listening to her. Questions, answers, the all you can't say stream to and fro, angry, agonized, and tender as the history of marriage. Then we arrived and she didn't have time to play. It gave me a notion women do their music making away from home. Later, she joined an orchestra. I remember her practicing trills from the Pastoral Symphony, where the clarinet, alone, has to drop perfect sound into perfect silence, suspend the world, then descend to the waiting ear. The almost nothing bone, that little house of hearing, which brought the two of them together, and which Beethoven lost. So hard to discover and make perfect, even half perfect in yourself. So I think listening was really one of the first disciplines I learned. And when I launched this book in London, really at the BBC, I was asked suddenly on the spot to play it with a very famous pianist, Stephen Hough. Me speaking over the Moonlight Sonata, and I thought, oh my God, I can't do this. And Stephen looked as aghast as I did. But you do what a producer says. So I said, all right, well, we'll try, but if you don't like it, let's do it separately. But it came off, and I think it came off because we were both so used to listening to each other. Could we have the Moonlight Sonata, please?
Poetic and musical, we're going to attempt in the front of the studio.
Moonlight Sonata. We make the life we need. The city's bells are muffled. The sky is frozen copper. You still can hear sometimes, still win the improvising contests. A sonata in C-sharp minor, quasi-fantasia, like a blind girl lit by moonlight she cannot see. New melodies unfold from tiny seeds. Euphoria, then presto agitato, manic rage. The music of loss, of losing. Bass clef, high treble only once and in despair. Then the new shocked calm of, is it true? Is this what it sounds like? Going deaf.
Well, I've just got to explain to people that that was totally unrehearsed, totally spontaneous. I did put you on the spot, and that was first take.
Hello?
You're back on.
We're back.
All right. So so that was Beethoven. He wrote that in 1801. He called it Sonata quasi una fantasia, and it really engulfs both tenderness and peace, but also later on a manic rage, as I say there. And after that, he just went on until he fell in love, really. About in 1812, it was 10 years after this. He was getting deafer and deafer. He was very successful, but not ever in love. And he fell in love with a woman he called his immortal beloved. And it went wrong. Whatever went wrong there, we don't know. But he then had 4 years of barrenness. It's funny in a sort of creating person's life. You get these, he'd come to the end of his heroic writing in a way. And he just needed a new mode, a new voice. And this coincided with the loss of this last love. And so he had these 4 barren years. But during these barren years, he began to read a lot. And this was just at the time when the Romantics, sparked by Goethe, by lots of people, were reading Oriental things. And he was reading Shakuntala. Extraordinary, isn't it? And he even wrote out the notes of the Indian scale, sa, re, ga. He got one wrong, but but I want to read the poem about Shakuntala, because he identified not with the man, of course, but with the woman who loses her love and has to go looking for her, the man who has apparently forgotten her. He thought that endurance, Shakuntala says at one point, you have to endure, you have to go endure these rocky paths. So I've called this poem India Dreams. And I'm talking here to Beethoven himself. And for these years of barrenness in the wilderness, he kept a journal. So we know much, much more about what he's reading, what he's thinking. poor man. India dreams. You are even more alone. Ear trumpets don't help, but you pretend they do. Glass filled with the moon's dry wine, your shadows soft on the ceiling. A moment when every silence in the world conspires with every other. You write out notes of the Indian scale. You read Hindu mystics and Shakuntala, copy advice given to the faithful wife searching for a husband cursed to forget her on how to endure. On your journey through this earth, your path will be now high, now low. The traces of your feet will be uneven. Virtue will drive you on. Giving up on Eros and his blindness, you cleave to Brahma, the one bright eye, a single coin of light opening in the dark of pagodas you picture on mountain peaks in India. What we forget makes us who we are. Most of our life vanishes in the swirls of the brain's mysterious mirror, but you can't stop looking back at scarlet pearls strewn through the desert, footprints of blood, your journey away from love.
Oh, goodness.
But after that, he then breaks through, first of all, with a group of songs to the distant beloved, and then to the great late works and the late quartets. Shall I finish with the poem about kissing the manuscript? Have I got enough time?
Of course you do, yes.
Yes, okay. So when I was very excited when I went to Poland, to Krakow, because that is where the manuscripts of the late quartets are. And I was invited to give a talk and a reading, and I said, could somebody take me to this place? So I was alone with the manuscript of the greatest quartet of all, Opus 131 in C sharp minor. And so this is really my contact with Beethoven, not through the ear, but through touch, through the page. And so I'm describing going to see this famous manuscript. Blue placard in a leafy street, the ordinary trance of morning light on flickery poplars, wind-blown jade. I never believed I'd meet him here, still less that my fingers could touch his touch on the page. Another chance to be new again. Does being deaf break the chains? Could he have written this otherwise? Fugue and variation lead to rebirth, regeneration. The initial theme transformed into 1,000 petioles and branches, all carrying the DNA of the first seed. Black cobweb crossings out, 5 sharps like wriggling insects. I can't imagine how any player could read this, but I recognize the voices. First solo, then together. Now angry and loud, now gentle. I remember my father saying, you could tell from this everything of the human. Yearning, loving, in despair, then calm. Amused and jokey, sotto voce, beyond loss. 3 bars slashed out. The way he wrote espressivo. Here, over pale lines of the stave, the famous tortured entries one by one. When the librarian isn't looking, I kiss the corner of the page. My brother, who's a scholar, a Celtic scholar, said I should never read that out in public because it was horrific to even touch the manuscript, let alone kiss it.
That's a sacred relic now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ruth, that was absolutely amazing. There's so much that you put forth. As you were speaking, for instance, it struck me that I'd never realized that Shakuntala is a kind of a ring cycle in itself. I mean, it's based on the ring as a mythic motif. But I was also struck by your invocation of Prometheus and the way in which Beethoven saw himself as a Promethean figure. And these are the Napoleonic years. Napoleon's a powerful presence in Beethoven's life and was also a kind of Promethean figure in a certain way. And Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein around 1818, and the subtitle of the book, which not a lot of people remember, is The Modern Prometheus. So there was this tremendous sense of seizing fire from the heavens, creativity, taking charge of one's own life. And you can see how that's part of a larger political moment. So before we move on to Jeeth, Ruth, something I want to ask you about your own practice in this book and in the book that you did on Charles Darwin, which is also a life in poems. You've improvised around the form of the biography. It's normally thought of as a nonfiction academic genre, heavily footnoted, but you've amazingly improvised around this genre. Told the story of life in verse, which is how it used to be done traditionally, and not done away with the footnotes either. It's a marvelously hybrid form. So, could you speak to us a little bit about the attraction of this form for you?
Yes, I think it derives from sort of two impulses in me, and one is the lyric and the singing, and the other one is the scholar, because I started, as you said, as a classical scholar and wrote a couple of books about Greek tragedy and so on. So I have a need to explain, I think, which I think in poetry I'm rather ashamed of. Poetry doesn't like to explain. Poetry just likes to put it out there and to sing. And when I sing, I don't feel I have the need to explain. But somehow these two figures, Darwin, first of all, Darwin I knew very well because he's a family figure. He was my grandmother's grandfather. She did a lot of scholarship about him. I knew the places, Cambridge, even the Galapagos, where he'd been. And for his I had amazing sort of letters. There's so much correspondence and letters from him. So really what I needed was the footnotes, because I didn't want to sort of pretend to put things into his mind that he didn't say. He said so many things himself. So actually there was an Iraqi man down the street who used to help me with my computers when they went wrong. And he showed me how to open a text box. And as soon as I knew how to open a text box, that was it. I could put marginalia. So I was very grateful to him. But for Beethoven, I wanted sort of something different. There's an amazing amount of stuff about Beethoven too. But of course, there's the music, and the music is prime. And the music came more viscerally out of playing him and singing him and listening to him. So I put all the notes for Beethoven at the back. I hope to write them sort of quite stylishly, but it's a little sort of potted biography, which is also stepping stones through the poems. I think I don't know what you feel, Ranjit or Jeeth, but how do we all as poets write into a horizon of audience and listeners who have so many different things in their heads? In the Western tradition, when Keats or Tennyson were writing, they could write to people who knew more or less the same stuff, same culture in their heads. I mean, Keats hardly knew Latin and certainly didn't know Greek. Tennyson knew both by the time he was about 5. But so they might know more or less of it, but they knew the same stuff. Now in Britain, I will be writing for people who may not know who Apollo is. I don't know if this is the same thing in India, because in India you have so many different traditions all coming together, but you all have the Mahabharata, you all have the Ramayana. There are some of the same myths and the same landscapes. But what do you do when you're addressing quite other people? And that means, how do you get across knowledge, which is important for you to know if you're going to understand the poem deeply, but you don't want to tell people about it in the poem? I think it's a really interesting problem.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And in the spirit of music, we've segued marvelously from you to Jeeth, because has Jeeth frozen? No. Jeeth, can you hear us?
He seems to be frozen, so maybe.
Oh. Yeah,
Oh,
Jeeth?
there he is.
No, I think we probably have an internet problem there.
Yes. Do you want to, would it be all right to move to Shubha then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll bracket that question of the audience, but so much that you said, I kept making notes here saying this is something I'm going to put to Shubha at that point. Particularly, let me begin with this kind of early moment of socialization in music, where with Beethoven there was both the immediate ethos of the family and then the larger tradition, the larger musical lineage, the larger sense of acquiring skills and socializing yourself into this kind of tradition. So, Shubha, there's this marvelous story, and I don't think it's apocryphal, right? Where you originally trained in dance, and it's a lovely story, so please don't tell me that someone made it up. Where apparently you were sent off to a competition, a Kathak competition, and the judges asked you, "कि आप कौन से घराने का कथक नाचती हैं?" And you said, "मैं हम अपने ही घराने का कथक नाचती हैं," meaning uh, I dance to my own tradition of Kathak, so to speak. So, which I think is a marvelous statement of a kind of autodidactic resolution and sense of purpose. So, could I ask? This is the question I have for you, Shubha. In your practice, there's both this tremendous, marvelously impetuous energy of the autodidact, someone who works across and crafts a tradition, but also someone who's gone through the riyas and the sadhana of being apprenticed to the great tradition. So could you take us through that, through your early socialization, early training, early development of a perspective on music?
Well, as you have rightly shared with everybody, my ignorance at the age of 4 made me say that I danced my own tradition. Little did I know what I was claiming to do. And ever since, I've sort of cowered in a corner and said, no, I wish I hadn't said that. But really speaking, my entry into the world of music was sort of ushered in by parents who were deeply, deeply respectful about the arts and had studied Hindustani classical music, and my mother had studied dance. But they did not take it up as a full-time commitment. They actually ended up teaching English literature at the University of Allahabad. But they were constantly consumed by their love for music, and they made it I think it was they decided early on in our lives that my sister, my only other sibling, and I would get ample exposure to the arts, and we started off by starting to learn dance. And it's only when I was about 17 that my formal training and talim in Hindustani classical music started, although I was listening to a lot of music throughout my early childhood and throughout my schooling and college days. I was also living in a home which was very passionate about poetry. Because my parents were teachers in the university. We lived in an area where the university had provided accommodation to several teachers. And our neighbor on the right hand side was Firaq Gorakhpuri. Across, not very far from where we lived, was Mahadevi Verma. And one of the great people who treated us like family was the great Sumitra Nandan Pant. So the Chayavad poets were very much part of my life, and I knew that my parents revered all these people greatly. I knew that they were very special. But it's also interesting that one of the first compositions that I did was at my mother's urging, when she asked me to set to tune a very beautiful poem of Sumitra Nandan Pant from his fantasy called Jyotsna. And in Jyotsna, he personifies Sandhya, or the evening. And my mother said that, why don't you try and compose this? I had no idea of how to compose, how to set about doing this. But of course, as I've done all my life, I started borrowing from the system of rag and tal that I was being trained in. And so all through my life, a lot of the compositions that I've done, a lot of the poetry that I've been drawn almost compelled. I feel a compulsion to sing it, and I indulge that compulsion, and I've been trying that for ever since. I think I must have been about 20 when I started doing this, and so I'm not really a Vagyakar or a poet who's also setting her uh, her poems to music. I'm actually borrowing from a lot of classical literature, a lot of literature that I've been reading over the years, and this is very varied, and I started off by trying to sing these poems, adapt them for use in the Khayal and Thumri Gaiki that I was studying. So I remember that my first composition was Jyotsna, and I remember that I composed it in Ek Tal and to Shyam Kalyan, the rag Shyam Kalyan, and it was this, sort of this about this drowsy-eyed beauty, Sandhya, and alas palak saghan alak shamal chavi chaya, swapnil man tandril tan shithil vasan maya. So I very, it was not the language that was used in Khayal or Tumri Dadra, and so it was more the modern Hindi that we know today. It didn't have the lyrical quality of, let's say, Braj Bhasha or Awadhi, and yet I sang that as I could manage to sing it at that point of time. Then I also started doing what many composers in the Hindustani tradition have done, which is to take extracts from longer padas and extract certain parts of those poems to be able to use them for the structure, the compositional structure that is followed in Khayal and Thumri Dadra. And very often, there is this tradition of composing a joda in Hindustani music. So you actually create a kind of a joda or pair for an existing composition. And I think I was learning how to compose by trying to make something trying to borrow from something that my guru had composed. Pandit Ramashray Jha, Ram Rang, one of the greatest composers and scholars of contemporary Hindustani music. I had the good fortune to learn from him. And so I would often base my compositions on something that he had composed, but the phonetic freshness, the refreshing part of it would be that I was actually trying to, that was not like a template, but more like a guide. So let's say I would take a existing composition of his in Maru Bihag, and the mukhra or the face of my composition would be very similar to his composition, but not completely the same. Not just because I was using other lyrics, but also because at some point of time I started deviating into what I felt was perhaps the melody that I would like to sing. And I started creating these ragdari compositions in Vilambit Khayals, Madhile Khayals, Thumri compositions. And maybe if I can play one to you, just to give
Please.
you an idea of that. I'll just try and do that. So I think, just give me a minute. That was the Sthayava Maru Bihag Rupak composition. It's from a live concert. It's a recording from a live concert where I was accompanied on the tabla by Anish Pradhan and on the harmonium by Sudhir Nayak. And the lyrics are by Mirza Raja Savaiv Pratap Singh Ji of Jaipur, who wrote under the pen name of Brajnidhi. So I started, this is the entire pad is much longer, but I've extracted a small portion, keeping in mind the words that would be conducive to the kind of elaboration and badhat and vistar that is required in Khayal Gayaki. I'm also fascinated by the use of, multiple dialects in one pad. So, for example, the same poet, look at the Madhyalaya composition where you also hear shades of Punjabi. Let me see if I can play that to you. So as the taking the narrative forward, for Marubihag, I've used the words of both the poetry of Brajnidhi for both the Vilambit Khayal and the Madhyalaya Khayal. So very often I try and do that as well, because I feel it's a nice bridge that is made from the Vilambit to the Madhya or the Drut, whatever area I'm traversing. So I've tried to do this kind of work very often, and I've also, it's very common to find poetry that was written by, let's say, the classic poets, the great saint poets, Surdas, Kabir, in Khayal and Thumri compositions. But I've tried to look a little further as well. And for example, one of the compositions that I created was from the poetry of Sayyid Shah Barkatullah Pemi from the Hardoi district in Uttar Pradesh. He wrote in several languages, including Farsi, but also wrote in Braj Bhasha and Awadhi. And I found this particular very attractive composition, which I'd like to just play a short piece for you.
घन ताल लेत नदी नारे
So some compositions like this where I'm really attracted to the images of nature, and the fact that the poet is also saying Bajat Nagare Ghan. The nagaras are there, the musical instruments are there, but it's actually part of nature that is creating those instruments also. It's the thunder clouds that are playing the nagara. It's the lapping of the rain water that is keeping time with the nagara. It's the jhingur, that is the cricket, that is really creating all the music. It's sort of nature that is creating this wonderful music. I'm drawn to those elements also. And that's how I've been trying to use my training and the language of Ragdari music, and reacting to various kinds of poetry that I've really enjoyed and felt the need to sing. I have no idea whether these will find acceptance or not amongst the orthodox listeners. I just slip them in sneakily now and again in a concert, refusing to say who composed it. And sometimes I'm surprised at the warm response, or when people say that, or when somebody else sings it another time and says it's a traditional composition. At the same time, I'm sometimes wondering whether there is any point in working like this if you don't have your own identity in that composition. But these are some of this is part of the journey that I've been going through and enjoying immensely. I'm sure there are several who frown at these experiments also, but I've quite enjoyed it, and I cannot help rely on the vocabulary and grammar of Ragdari music. So even when I work on compositions which again I felt compelled to sing. For example, the great poetry of Kunwar Narayanji. For a long time I've wanted to sing Ayodhya, his poem Ayodhya 1992, in public. And I'd worked on it but never had the chance to really present it, because I also didn't have permission to really sing the poem. So I was very fortunate when about a year ago his son Apurva Narayan sort of gave me permission to sing that at a concert in Delhi. And there again, the poem opens with this dramatic, "Hey Ram, Jeevan ek katu yatharth hai, aur tum ek mahakavya." And I'm wondering, how shall I sing this? I felt that perhaps the direct way in which Kamod approaches, in the way in which the melody of Kamod reveals itself, perhaps that would be a good way to try out and try singing Ayodhya. And I've tried to do that. Let me try and play a small clip from that as well. And this, of course, I've never sung in a concert of Hindustani classical music, but nevertheless, my reliance on Hindustani classical music remains when I sing this. Let me try and play that to you. तुम्हारे बस की नहीं हे राम, हे राम, हे यथार्थ है और तुम एक महाकाव्य हे राम, हे राम, जीवन एक कटु यथार्थ है और तुम एक महाकाव्य बस की नहीं, तुम्हारे बस की नहीं, उस अविवेक पर विजय तुम्हारे बस की नहीं, उस अविवेक पर विजय जिसके 10-20 नहीं, अब लाखों सर लाखों हाथ हैं, और विभीषण भी अब ना जाने किसके साथ है। हे राम, हे राम. So that's what I've been up to with the poetry and the music.
That is extraordinary. I mean, Kanwar Narayan Singh's poetry. I mean, to take one of the greatest of the Hindi modernists and a poem that is a political critique.
Yes.
And to find a place for it in the tradition of Hindustani music. This is an amazing experiment, really.
I later got to do an entire concert, and so an entire new repertoire for me on Kanwar Narayan ji's poetry, where I chose several of his poems. Again, I relied on the rag, very many of the rags that I have studied, but also on the Thumri Dadra repertoire a little, to try and bring elements depending on what the poems, how the poems spoke to me. I would select how I would like to compose it, and how I'd like to, whether or not to do any vistar in it, or whether merely set it to a melody and sing the entire poem from beginning to end without too many interventions, too much of ornamentation. But it was it was a wonderful challenge and an experience for me to be able to work on the poetry of somebody whose work I've admired for a long time, and who happens to be in that amongst the greatest of the Nai Kavita poets. And in the same vein, I'm now working on the poetry of Vijay Dev Narayan Sahi. I hope that I'll be able to sing it soon, but it's still in the making. It's still not ripe enough for me to share it with everyone.
But you know, Shubha, I have the same question that I was going to pose to Jeeth before he vanished and is happily back with us. But yeah, but the question that Ruth flagged at the end of her presentation, because all of us, all three of you certainly, are addressing audiences of, I have to say it, different levels of competence. You can't predict what cultural assumptions or what kind of musical training or what kind of understanding of poetry or literature they bring to listening. And Shubha, if this is one kind of radical approach, Kanwar Narayan Singh's poetry being set to music, but what you're doing in the other direction chronologically is also political, because you're drawing on the Ritikal, which is a past that, I'm sorry to say, but a certain kind of Hindi presentism has wanted to consign to the dustbin of history, because it has complicated truths. It tells you that Mughal emperors, Mughal princes, Rajput rulers, priests, mendicants, all kinds of people were together in the Kavikul, in the family of poets who wrote in Braj, but were also multilingual, wrote in other languages. And their language use, the linguistic use, as you demonstrated, actually is multilingual. It's completely the opposite of our very strange monolingual modernism, where we are each trapped in our own linguistic citadels. So when you present, say, the work of Brajnidhi, what is your expectation of how the audience receives it, apart from their general satisfaction at having had an aesthetic experience? How do they engage with these histories that you're bringing to them?
Sometimes I find that in some centers, let's particularly in North India, people do respond to the fact that it is a Brajniti poem. Rarely have I found anybody who has mentioned to me that, oh, this poem, this composition that you sang was by so and so. They haven't recognized the poet while I present it. But if I say that if I announce that this is a poem by Brajnidhi, then several people react in different ways. They say, but some say it was a much longer poem, and the manner in which it was presented in Hindustani classical style, we didn't realize that you were singing Brajnidhi, although we have read this poem. Some will say, oh, there's another poem which is beautiful, you should try and compose that. And so I get a lot of people who actually help me. They send me their curated lists as well. A lot of friends, scholars, and sometimes even people from my audiences who will send me literature and say, we heard you sing that, how about singing this as well? And of course, it's not always that I can say, yes, I will, because I have no idea whether I will be able to do that. But so I get different responses. And yes, there are some people who do not respond at all to the poetry, many in fact, because I think um, even familiarity with Hindi is now on the decline. And so Bhasha and Awadhi
Yeah.
certainly are dialects which may be acceptable in certain areas. I mean, even though Khayal and Thumri Dadra are sung in so many places, I mean, the important centers are Bengal, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and yet the literature and the Sahitya of the text is somehow not of great significance to many listeners and many musicians themselves.
Is there a way to at least tackle that problem through pedagogy? I mean, what is it like to, because you and Anish both teach as well. So what is it like to draw people who come to you to study music into a world where the song text, the bandish, the pada, these also have a life as poems?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's necessary, I feel. In fact, I've often said that it would be a great idea for students of music to study at least one Indian language, if not more. I myself feel that I mean, I feel a lack of qualification because I haven't studied, let's say, Bangla. I'm not able to read and write Bangla. I'm not able to read and write Marathi. I mean, I can read Marathi, but because the script is, it's possible to read. But the intimacy with the language and fluency with the language is certainly something that I often crave. And I think it's very necessary to include courses on literature for students of vocal music also. I would say for all students of music, even if they are studying instrumental music, because they're often playing guts that are modeled on vocal compositions. So it would be a good idea, but I don't think that's happening in a hurry in music institutions.
Thank you so much, Shubha. We'll pick up on some of these questions later when all three of you come together in the kind of plenary session. But I'm going to carry these thoughts with me to Jeeth, actually. Uh, Jeeth, you've had you have three lives at least as a poet, as a novelist, and as a musician. And what always struck many of us when we first read your poems was this incredible sense of beat, the rich musicality. Uh, where did all this begin for you? I don't want to ask that classical question of which came first, because that's very difficult to answer, because sometimes the source of your artistic creativity lies in some yet third art. But can you can you draw us into your childhood, your teenage years, your exposure to music?
Sure. First of all, just let me apologize for the very up and down nature of my interaction today. I didn't mean to disappear, but and also, if it happens again, as we are all musicians and musicologists and music students, we will have to use the quality of improvisation. So I'm going to leave it to you until I come back, if it happens again. I Thanks for that question. For me, poetry and music were really the first art forms that did something to me as a 13-year-old, and I absorbed it and kind of converted to it really like a new religion. And they were I didn't realize at the time that they were two separate strands. I saw them as one. And I was reading the French poets to begin with. I was reading Baudelaire, Verlaine, Rimbaud, Villon. I read the French poets one after the other, and then discovered the British poets of the mid 20th century. But it was the French that I found first. And at the same time, I became a kind of a fanatical follower, as many of us did in the 70s, of American contemporary music, and began to play guitar, self-taught, and the blues in particular, which I did see connections with Indian music at the time, because it is a kind of a call and response thing. There is a couplet that's repeated, and then there's a punchline that follows at the end of the 12 bars. And I responded to that in a very profound kind of way, and did these two things side by side without any sense of making a career out of them. At the time, it was purely fun, and I was also drawing at the time, and a lot of kind of line drawings, and I was interested in film as well. And of course, as I grew older, and I learned fear, and I learned socialization, I learned to be afraid of some of these half talents that I might have had. So of course, I stopped drawing, and I stopped, but I never did stop playing the guitar and being interested in music, and I never did stop reading at any point from that time to now. And now that I think about it, I see, of course, that poetry and music really are one thing. And fiction is not. That is a completely different discipline. It's a different art form. It requires a different part of your brain. It is the kind of brain that bankers use, because you sit on a chair from 9 to 5, like you have working hours like bankers. You learn to become a very steady, disciplined, boring person. You do not have late nights. You wake up early. It is a job. And it's the kind of job in which you can never please your boss, as novelists know. It's the kind of job in which you're constantly underpaid and overworked. The thing about poetry and music, of course, is it's exactly the opposite. It is a question of joy. There's a reason musicians get cancer less than other people. This is a statistic. Musicians get cancer much less than people who work in jobs, because there's a constant, what's inside you comes out of you. You're letting it out instead of keeping it bottled in. That's part of your job. It is expression. And I think it's very similar with poets. But of course, poets have a kind of a professional hazard, which is, I think, mental health. We're not exactly known for robust mental health. I think I can be excused for saying that. It's historically proven. Whereas this isn't the case with novelists. Novelists are just, they're always dependable in every way you can imagine. And similarly with musicians, we can all draw up a list from the top of our heads of musicians who have lost their minds, and produced amazing work while that was happening. In rock music, in fact, I can think of musicians whose mental deterioration you can actually chart in the music. And some of the music that they were composing at the time, absolutely timeless. Sid Barrett, for instance, that song, the Bicycle Song, just absolutely moving. A child's lyrics. I've got a bike, you can ride it if you like. It's got a basket, bells, and always makes me feel good. I'd lend it to you if I could, but I borrowed it. You know, just gorgeous, childlike melody and lyrics, and you can see what happens to his mental faculties as his career progresses. Can you hear me? Can
Jeeth,
you
we can
guys
hear you.
hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. So really, for me, as the practice developed as I grew up, I in terms of poetry, I did write for the page for most of my life, and I've lately been using certain poems in a musical setting with the band, but it's a very specific kind of poem that you use in a musical setting. I think it was Auden who said that when he writes a libretto as opposed to a poem, it's about using far fewer words than he would use in a poem. Of course, because when you sing a line, you should really not put more than 4 or 5 words into it. If possible, 4 or 5 syllables. And because that's when that idea will be expressed with full force. Whereas if you have a lot of words, those words are being lost. And also, you have other tools at your command when you are setting a poem to music. You have melody, you have rhythm, you have beat, you have so many things. So the words really become one strand of a many stringed instrument. And I've noticed that the kind of poems that I have been using with this band, especially HMT, I sometimes rewrite the poems to reduce the number of words. Sometimes I drop stanzas. Sometimes I use only certain lines. And it also reminds me of something I'd done a few years ago with the poems. This was Ranjit, soon after Dom, Nissim, and Arun died in the same year, which was 2004. I did a kind of a tribute to them where I used their poems in a musical setting. And it was very interesting that with Dom and Arun, with Dom and Nissim, it was very, very easy to find songs that fit musically because they wrote iambic for the most part. The meter was very clear. With Arun, it was much more difficult. Because you have to read him on the page to get the nuance of what he's saying, to get the kind of sarcasm and that humor. And I eventually ended up using just one line from several pages that I printed out of Arun's poems. And that line was, "Trees arrive at themselves." It's a line from Pie Dog, probably forgotten or ignored most of the time, but I found it really lent itself melodically and rhythmically because it's a longish sentence and the rhythms in it are so clear. Whereas a line by Nissim from, say, a poem like A Morning Walk, it's so iambic and the meter is so clear in these lines. For example, barbaric city, sick with slums, deprived of seasons, blessed with rains, its hawkers, beggars, iron-lunged, processions led by frantic drums, a million purgatorial lanes and childlike masses, many-tongued, whose wages are in words and crumbs. That's music. That's just very clearly music, and you have to do very little in terms of putting a beat under that to turn that into a song. And very much the same with Dom, as we know. Absolutely kind of religiously strict in terms of length lines and in terms of the meter in his poems from when he was 16 until his death in 2004. He stayed with that kind of very strict formalistic practice of his. And that really was one of the beauties and one of the strengths of his work, in that he used this kind of cage that he had set himself, this formal cage. He used it as a springboard to complete freedom. And I'll just read the poem by him that I set to music some years ago. This was in 2005, the year after he died. It's a poem called Another Weather, which was never collected. He wrote it when he was 16 or 17, and it was published in Le Revue Française. And I think he forgot about it, and it was never subsequently collected in any of his books. It was found by Adil Jasawala, of course, no surprise there, our great archivist, and he sent me the poem. And I'll just read this to you, and you'll hear the rhythm here. Winged things move in the fleecy pelt of heaven. The horses stroke the grass with their great hooves. Often this weather, when a wind has driven insects and dust through air, the landscape moves, tilting itself one way until this wind, shifting the world, has purified my mind. And it ends with this couplet, and I accept them all. What is my choice? I have few muscles. I must trust my voice. Which is almost like a motto for anybody who sings, as poets and musicians do.
That's fantastic. Dom used to say that he was tone deaf, and I never quite understood how or what he meant. On the other hand, both Nissim and Arun had actually tried to write songs.
That's right.
I mean, Arun actually, I think, had a vinyl out.
He had a truncated career as a pop singer. That's how he started. Yeah.
Yeah, and Nissim wrote a series of songs for his nephew Nandu Mende, who was a musician.
Right.
Yeah. So
who used those songs in a absolutely kind of psychedelic rock setting. And you can absolutely see how you could do that with Nissim's poems. Very, very easily translatable into music.
But Jeeth, I also sorry.
Go ahead, Ranjit.
Right, okay. Jeeth, I also wanted to put to you the same question that's kind of a running thread now. This question of who you would reach out to as your audience. Are these audiences intersecting, or do you feel that they occupy different niches in the cultural ecosphere? Your poetry on the one hand, the people who read your novels, and of course your music.
I don't differentiate, to tell you the truth. I think, for one thing, as a poet or a novelist or a musician, when I write songs in terms of lyrics, I really don't make much of a difference between the genres and or at least in terms of the kind of obsessions that you might bring to each discipline, because they never change. And I don't think you need to. I don't think you should worry about who is going to hear you and what they will understand from what they hear, whether they will get offended, because of course somebody will get offended. There's an army of people today, that's what we all share, whose only job is to sit by their phones looking for something to be offended by. And I think it's part of our job to give them that, we must be generous. We must give them something to be upset about. And but the thing is, if we think about that a lot, especially in India, the way things are right now, we know how dangerous it is. But if you think about that over much, it can cripple you as an artist. And uh, apart from that, am I frozen?
No, 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 we can hear you.
Am I frozen?
No, no, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. And apart from that, for example, if you were to make a reference to Prometheus, I think it's much easier, in fact, and in fact, you can do that with a far easier frame of mind today than you could have, say, 30 years ago, because of one thing: Google. Whenever we read things we cannot place immediately, we look it up in a second. So I think, in fact, it's a kind of liberating moment as well to be here at this point. You don't have to worry about who is going to understand what. You can say anything you want. You can bring in any kind of reference, any mythological reference, whether it's Indian or British or from any even a forgotten language, because you can look it up. The great resource of the internet is there for us all, and I think really it's a happy thing, along with, of course, all the things we have to worry about.
Of course, yeah. Jeeth, I also want to draw you out on what you just said about, of course, poetry and music being deeply and umbilically connected, but the novel being slightly to one side. And of course, as I look at all of you, Ruth and Jeeth both are poets and novelists. Shubha and Indira are writers of short fiction, along with everything else that they do. Shubha, meant to say that you took your revenge on... am I holding this up right or not? That's your revenge on the social world of music. but Jeeth, just to bring this back to the way you structure your novels, and at some point, if I remember correctly, you had a vast Henry Jamesian sort of baggy monster of a novel, which then became like an archive from which you drew out several novels. But did you find a musical imagination at work whilst you were structuring your novels? Because it's an immense effort to find an architecture for a novel.
Absolutely.
So could you tell us about whether music or the reflexes of music played some role in this?
Yes. Interesting you should say that about structure, because I think, especially in particular, when poets begin to write novels, the thing that the difficulty that strikes poets the most, I think, more than people who begin to write novels straight off the bat, I think is a question of structure, because it's difficult for us to think in terms of turning pages, and in terms of saving certain things, and in terms of setting up a conflict in the first 10 pages, and all those things that publishers tell you that you should do. It takes us a little while to kind of think in those terms, and I think that's why structure really is the thing that gets poets. But once poets crack structure, I think we do it better than most people. I think the novel that you were talking about, it was called This Is This, and I completed it in around, I think it was 2007 or 8, and it was it went into more than 1,000 pages, and it ended up, thanks to some very good advice, ended up carving 280 pages out of that for Narcopolis, and then carving out another chunk of it and adding about 100 pages to make Book of Chocolate Saints, and then a completely new thing for Low. And they really are 3 parts of one story. But I would look at the Book of Chocolate Saints in terms of a kind of a musicality, a musical structure, because it has an oral history section about the poets of Bombay, about Bombay in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, interspersed with a very contemporary story about a poet and artist, a painter and poet who returns to India in the early 2000s, and how his life unravels and how he dies, which is about the end of the book. So these two things are interspersed throughout, along with poems from a book that this writer is working on, and it's a book called The Book of Chocolate Saints. So you know what jazz musicians say? They say, if you play a wrong note once, that's a mistake. But if you play it twice, if you play that mistake twice, it becomes jazz. And this is actually a point about repetition. And really, that's what makes music. When you repeat a phrase or a melody, or you have a very long experimental section, but you return to that melody, that is the point about a musical movement, any kind of composition. And so using that idea, I used the idea in Chocolate Saints, where you kept returning to the same characters. You would leave them for 50 pages, and then you would return to them, and to that time, and to this very particularly humid world of the poets of Bombay in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then you would go off into Paris or London or Rome, and then return. So that really was a kind of musical notion. And I think the architecture of that book is possibly the most. Am I still here?
We heard
Yes,
you.
Jeeth, we can hear you.
Okay. And before this dies again, I just wanted to say something, Ruth. I came across a quote that I've been using lately with our band, which I think is just so naughty, and it's by almost wicked. It's John Cage, and he says, whenever you listen to Beethoven, it's always the same. But whenever you listen to Traffic, it's always different. You know, and I mean, in terms of what you were saying earlier about audience, and there will be people who take that absolutely seriously, thinking he means it, and you know, he doesn't like Beethoven. But also, I think if you hear it again, you'll see levels of irony in there, you know. And yeah, I thought you might enjoy that quote.
That's lovely. Yes.
Strange. I've also been going back to Cage and rereading Martin Feldman and thinking back to this moment of the avant-garde, particularly where you know, when you're much younger, you think that they're all about smashing the idols, and then you read them again in a more layered way and realize that there was actually a great deal of agonistic respect for the tradition, if you will, in some way. Yeah. But Jeeth, I also want to, sorry, Jeeth, you say.
Yes, no, just
Can I come there a second? Yeah, because in a way, one of the greatest, most important things of any tradition is breaking it. You break a line in poetry to make the poem, and you break the tradition in order to carry it on.
Sure. When I hear that line, when I hear Cage comparing Beethoven to Traffic, and when I hear him saying, when you listen to Beethoven, it's always the same. What we want is for it to be always the same.
Yeah.
I have in the beginning of my book, I have a quotation from Harrison Birtwistle, the composer. He says, if you want to think about order or disruption of order, you have to know what that order was in the first place.
Yeah.
Beethoven is a wonderful example. He never does what you think he's going to do. I suppose you could say the same of traffic. The surprise is perpetual. You know the shape of the music and you think, how's he going to get out of that without a cliche? Then he does something brilliant. That's his genius.
Lovely.
Yeah.
So I love that idea of repetition, but it's also about order and disruption of order. Maybe those are two sides of the same coin.
I also think of the wonderful David Bowie track, which is called Joy of Repetition. And this is off one of those 3 wonderful albums that he did during a phase of transition. And I think among musicians, especially, joy and repetition is one of those great melodies and songs that people keep referring to. Prince kind of played on it as well.
We need repetition for pattern. You know, I mean, if you think of any of the great patterns of mosaics, and you have to have repetition, but then you also have to have variation. And it's the sort of pulse between the two.
And I think it is the repetition that gives us pleasure. So the idea of joy coming from repetition, it's absolutely correct.
And variation also, as you've been saying, all 3 of you have actually been talking about that too. I mean, I was just thinking of the role of tempo. I mean, at some point during the lockdown, I was just listening to, you suddenly become aware of the work of the conductor and the role of tempo. You hear a Furtwängler, you hear a Klemperer, and you realize that there's a moment of shock when you think you know this piece of music perfectly, and it just sounds different. It's not the same. And there are all kinds of surprises in the tradition which are just waiting to be released somehow. But Jeeth, I wanted to, before we go into, we've kind of already slipped into the kind of plenary discussion, but there's just one thing that I wanted to ask you, which is to rearrange your 3 key practices in another kind of way, which is that as a poet, as a novelist, you're solitary in how you create. But your music has, by definition, a sort of collaborative dimension.
Always, absolutely.
So how do you switch gear? How do you give up a certain kind of solitary authorship?
Well, I've been sitting alone in a room from March until last week. From March 22 until last week, I've been pretty much alone in a room, and it's been, without question, one of the most productive times of my life. A big new anthology of poetry and a novel finished. But last week arrived in Goa, and I'm staying at my friend Sandeep's house, and we have done 4 gigs in 4 performances in 6 days. And it is absolutely collaborative. It changes from day to day because I'm living here and because this is where we put it all together. It's so easy, and it's just also what happens is when you play together a lot, you begin to kind of hear what the other person is going to do even before they do it. And you fall into a groove that is just absolutely easy. It is really also the emotion that it draws upon and that it creates is joy. And this is the exact opposite to the tortured writer sitting alone in a room with his demons and his obsession. This is the exact opposite. When you work with musicians and when you create something together on a completely collaborative basis. And really, I think in terms of mental health, this is what gives you as an artist mental health when you're working, what makes you feel happy and what keeps you grounded and together is really a kind of a mix of both those things, of sitting alone in a room and of getting out and being with people and creating something joyful or dark.
Which I think is probably a cue for us to go into the live performance, which you've promised us, Jeeth. Is that a possibility?
Yes. Okay. All right. Absolutely. Let's just pray that the internet holds.
Gods of the internet.
The gods of the internet is right, yeah.
Should I just do my thank yous before we go to live music, so then we can just close with the music? What do you think, Ranjit?
We could do that. We have about 20 minutes, right?
Yes, we have about 20 minutes. So while they set up, perhaps I can just say, I did have a question actually while they set up, or rather a comment. I appreciated that idea of repetition, something I've been thinking about even after Pallavi's comments in her Thousand Cranes, and the idea of repetition. And I thought also very much in Hindustani and Carnatic classical music, it's an aspect, right? It's a repetition, variation, repetition, variation. You play on that, so you tune your listener's ear into being embedded in the composition as well. So I just wondered if Shubha would like to comment on that while they set up.
Yes, in fact, the use of repetition as well as making slight deviations, it's almost like a very gradual moving away from first you actually state the composition, and then you start moving away from it, and coming back to the tension that is created between establishing that, straying away from it, and coming back, resolving again. I think that really creates an interesting tension in Hindustani classical music, and that is very much part of the discipline, as well as part of the discipline that you try and deviate from. So you are taught a silsila, you are given a structure, you are given devices, you are taught devices on how to actually state your bandish kaise kahein, that you are taught, and then how you keep on reinstating that bandish, then start doing badhat and vistar, how you make it bloom and grow. But each time you come back again to a pre-composed, you repeat the pre-composed bandish, and then again move back from it. I think those tensions that are created and resolved, and the manner in which they are created and resolved by the use of many devices, I think those are such an important aspect of not just Hindustani music, but also understanding composition. What will make a good statement which you can keep on repeating, and what will give you the ground, what will give you fertile ground for you to move away from it. I think those are such important aspects of both learning compositions and then learning to compose for Hindustani music. I think those are really very significant aspects.
Thank you.
Coming here, because that sounds so similar in some ways in Western composition to fugue and variation.
Yes.
Because a fugue is, I kept thinking, because Beethoven lived off fugues and variation, and often when he wrote letters to thank somebody, he would write a little fugue, say, "Thank you, doctor, for your visit," or something, and he'd put it into a fugue in his letter. And I thought, what is a fugue really? It's flight. Fuga is flight. And so you have the shape of something, and then you vary it, and you are following on from something else. It's so interesting the way you put it.
Yes, it is. It is, and also the manner in which it is approached by different artists. Because sometimes the approach is very orthodox, and sometimes you come across a musician who will completely, just when you thought that, okay, this is the rag that has been announced, and this is how you're going to enter that rag, a great artist will suddenly start from somewhere else and lead you into another perspective of the rag, and that possibility is infinite, actually, in a sense. But of course, very often on bad days, we have to rely on previous, familiar, nostalgic perspectives and fall back on that. But otherwise, the possibilities are quite infinite.
In a way, it's like conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. Looks like Jeeth is ready.
Jeeth looks like he's ready, yes.
Can you hear us? We're just going to play a little something and
Wonderful.
Tell us what the sound is like. And I'd like to introduce Sandeep Madhavan. His artist name is The Burning Day. The economy is broken, jobs are gone, the poor Jeeth, if you don't like it here, Pakistan isn't far away. If you want to stay, shut up, learn how to make in India. That was Ghazal 2020.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
One more for you. How is the sound?
Pretty good. Could have been better always if we were there sitting with you in Goa, but it was good.
Thank you so much, Jeeth. And
Thank
Sandeep
you.
and
We have
Marina.
one more for you.
They may well cut us off.
And that was Marina on vocals.
Okay. Thank you, Shubha, Ruth, Ranjit, Jeeth. If we don't get to say goodbye, in case they cut us off.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
In case they do. And if they don't, well, wonderful.
poison packed. You open your mouth and your sharks attack. You push at us, we kiss on you back. Oh, you think you're good, but you're so whack. You say saffron is the brand new black. You say saffron is the brand new black. You say saffron is the brand new black.